The doors of the great hall swung open before anyone was ready for them. Charlotte Vance stood at the edge of the raised platform, her hands folded in front of her, and watched 300 guests turn their heads at once. The murmurs stopped. The music stopped. Even the servants carrying trays of champagne froze mid-step, because everyone in that room understood that something important was about to happen, and nobody wanted to miss it. Her father, Edmund Vance, walked to the center of the platform, with the calm confidence of a man who had spent 40 years building an empire out of nothing. He wore a dark gray suit, tailored to perfection, and his silver hair caught the light from the chandeliers above. He looked, as he always did, like a man who had never once doubted himself. Charlotte knew better. She smiled anyway. It was a soft, practiced smile, the kind she had learned to wear since she was a child, sitting at the edge of boardroom meetings, watching grown men underestimate her father and then regret it. Tonight, that same smile hid something far more dangerous than politeness. It hid certainty. It hid a plan that had taken 3 months to build, piece by piece, in complete silence. Edmund raised a hand, and the room fell into a deeper silence. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall without the need for a microphone. Tonight is not only about celebrating 25 years of Vance Shipping. Tonight, I want to share something personal with all of you. A ripple of curiosity passed through the crowd. Board members exchanged glances. Old family friends leaned toward each other and whispered. Charlotte kept her eyes fixed on her father, though in her mind she was replaying a memory from 3 months earlier, a memory that had changed everything. It had started with a locked drawer. Charlotte had gone into her father's study late one evening to return a folder of shipping contracts. The drawer beneath his desk, usually locked, had been left open by mistake. Inside, she found a small leather notebook that did not belong to her father. It was worn at the edges, filled with handwriting that was not his. She had almost put it back without opening it. Almost. But something about the initials on the inside cover, GL, had made her pause. She knew only one person connected to her father with those initials, a woman named Grace Linley, who had entered their lives 8 months earlier as a marketing consultant hired to modernize the Vance Shipping brand. Grace was clever, warm, and impossible to dislike. She had a way of making people feel like the most interesting person in the room. Charlotte had liked her too, in the beginning. She had watched her father, a man who had been alone since Charlotte's mother passed away 9 years earlier, slowly come back to life around Grace. His laugh returned. His shoulders relaxed. For the first time in years, he looked like someone who still believed good things could happen to him. That was exactly why the notebook frightened Charlotte so much. Inside its pages were notes, dates, and numbers that had nothing to do with marketing. There were details about shipping routes that only senior executives should have known. There were names of competitors, including one that stood out immediately: Ashcombe Global Freight, the company that had been trying, and failing, to push Vance Shipping out of 3 major ports for the last 2 years. Charlotte had read every page twice that night, sitting on the floor of her father's study with her back against the wall, her heart pounding harder with each line. By the time she closed the notebook, she understood 2 things clearly. The first was that Grace Linley was not who she claimed to be. The second was that if Charlotte exposed her too quickly, whoever was really behind this would simply disappear and try again through someone else. She needed to know everything. She needed proof, strong enough that no one, especially not her father, could dismiss it as jealousy or suspicion. So she had said nothing. She had smiled at Grace over dinner. She had asked polite questions about her work. She had begun, quietly and carefully, to build a case. Now, standing on the platform beside her father, Charlotte watched him prepare to say the words that would either save the company or destroy it, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. Many of you have met her already, Edmund continued, and Charlotte saw Grace step forward from the front row of guests, wearing a deep green dress that suited her perfectly. Grace's eyes were bright, her smile genuine, or at least it appeared that way to anyone who did not know what Charlotte knew. Grace has not only helped rebuild this company's image, Edmund said, reaching for her hand as she climbed the 2 small steps onto the platform. She has rebuilt something in me that I thought was gone for good. The crowd made a soft sound, somewhere between surprise and delight. A few guests began to clap before they understood exactly what was happening. Charlotte kept her hands folded and her smile steady. though inside her chest her heart was beating so hard, she wondered if the people standing closest to her could hear it. "I am asking Grace to stand beside me, not only in this company, but in my life," Edmund said. Publicly, and without any doubt. The applause began in earnest now, scattered at first, then growing, as more guests joined in. Grace's cheeks flushed with what looked like genuine emotion. She glanced at Charlotte, just for a second, and Charlotte saw something flicker behind those bright eyes. It was so brief that most people would have missed it entirely. But Charlotte had spent 3 months studying every expression Grace made, every pause before she answered a question, every time her gaze moved toward the door before it moved back to the room. That flicker was not love. It was calculation. Charlotte had seen enough evidence over the past 3 months to know that this moment, the very moment her father was choosing to make his feelings public, was not a coincidence. It was the moment Grace and whoever she worked for had been waiting for. A public announcement meant press coverage. Press coverage meant details about the Vance family being printed in newspapers and shared online, details about security schedules, about upcoming shipments, about weaknesses that the wrong people could use. 3 days earlier, sitting in a small office, 2 floors below the estate's east wing, Charlotte had finally found what she needed. A single message, intercepted with help from a source she trusted completely, that confirmed everything. Grace Linley was not simply gathering information. She was preparing to pass along details of a shipment scheduled to leave the western port at the end of the month. A shipment worth more than the company had earned in the previous 2 years combined. If that shipment fell into the wrong hands, or was deliberately delayed and sabotaged, Vance Shipping could lose everything it had built. And the person set to receive that information was Victor Ashcombe himself. Charlotte had wanted to walk straight into her father's office and tell him everything the moment she found that message. She had wanted to protect him the simplest way possible, with the plain truth. But she also knew her father. Edmund Vance was not a man who accepted claims without proof, especially not claims about someone he had grown to trust and, it seemed, to love. If Charlotte accused Grace without absolute certainty, Edmund might dismiss it as his daughter's protectiveness, or worse, Grace might sense the danger and vanish before anyone could stop her, taking her secrets and her employer's plans with her. So Charlotte had done the harder thing. She had waited. She had smiled through dinners and company events. She had let Grace believe that nothing had changed, all while working quietly with Daniel Pierce, the head of estate security, a man who had worked for the Vance family since before Charlotte was born, and whose loyalty had never once wavered. Daniel stood now near the back of the hall, dressed like any other guest, but Charlotte knew he was watching everything, exactly as they had planned. His eyes met hers across the crowded room, for a brief second. She gave the smallest nod, so small that no one else would have noticed it at all. "Not yet," that nod said. "Wait." On the platform, Edmund was still speaking, his hand resting warmly over Grace's. "I know some of you may find this sudden," he said, laughing gently. "But at my age, you learn not to waste time on things you are certain about." The crowd laughed with him, warm and easy. Somewhere near the back, a woman wiped a tear from her eye. Charlotte felt a pull of sympathy for her father, sharp and sudden, because she understood that whatever came next would break something in him that had only just begun to heal. But she also understood that the alternative, letting this moment pass unchallenged, could break far more than his heart. It could break the company, the hundreds of families who depended on it for work, and possibly her father's safety as well, if Ashcombe Global Freight was willing to go as far as Charlotte suspected they were. Grace turned toward the crowd, her hand still resting in Edmund's, and for a moment, she looked entirely at peace, as though she had already won. Charlotte felt the leather notebook, now safely locked away in a security office downstairs, weigh on her mind like a stone. She thought of the message about the shipment. She thought of the name Victor Ashcombe written in careful handwriting, on page after page. She thought of her mother, who had died believing in her husband's ability to protect what they had built together, and Charlotte silently promised that she would not let that belief die with him. The applause in the hall was still rising when Edmund lifted his hand once more, asking for quiet so he could finish what he had started. "There is one more thing," he said, and something in his tone made Charlotte's pulse quicken. This was not part of the plan she and Daniel had prepared for. This was something new. Grace's smile flickered again, just slightly, The same calculation Charlotte had seen moments before. "I have decided," Edmund continued, his voice steady and full of quiet pride, "to move the timeline for the Western Port shipment forward by 2 weeks, and I am placing Grace in charge of coordinating the final details." The room erupted into fresh applause, guests turning to congratulate each other on the good news for the company, completely unaware of the danger those words had just created. Charlotte felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she did not move an inch. If Grace gained direct control over the shipment details now, tonight, in front of every reporter and board member in the room, there would be no time left to wait, no time to gather more proof, no time to plan a quiet, careful exposure that would protect her father's reputation and the company's future. Charlotte looked once more toward the back of the hall, and this time her eyes found Daniel Pierce and held them. She took a slow breath, stepped forward beside her father and Grace, and let the smile on her face settle into something colder, something the room had never seen from her before. The moment had arrived, sooner than she wanted, but she was ready. 3 months earlier, before any of this began, Charlotte had been sitting in her father's study, reading over a stack of quarterly reports, when Daniel Pierce knocked on the open door. "You wanted to see the visitor logs," he said, holding a slim folder. Charlotte had asked for those logs after noticing something strange in Grace's schedule. Twice in 1 month, Grace had left the estate late at night and returned only hours before sunrise, always claiming she had been meeting with printing vendors for the new marketing campaign. Charlotte had checked those vendors herself. None of them worked such hours. None of them had any record of meeting with Grace at all. Daniel had agreed to help quietly, without informing Edmund. He trusted Charlotte's instincts, and more importantly, he had his own reasons for concern. Years earlier, before joining the Vance family, Daniel had worked in corporate security for a firm that once handled contracts for Ashcombe Global Freight. He recognized certain patterns, certain habits of movement, that reminded him uncomfortably of tactics used by people trained to gather information without leaving a trace. "There's something else," Daniel had said that evening, setting the folder on the desk. "I ran a check on the phone number she used to schedule her interview 8 months ago, back when she first applied for the consulting position. And it traces back to a private answering service, the kind used by companies that don't want their real number showing up anywhere public." Charlotte had felt a chill then, the first true confirmation that her suspicion was not simply overprotectiveness. "Keep looking," she had said, quietly. "I don't want my father to know anything until we're certain." And if we never become certain? Charlotte had looked out the window toward the gardens, where her father and Grace were walking together, laughing at something neither Charlotte nor Daniel could hear. "Then I'll have wasted my time protecting someone who never needed it," she had said. "I can live with that. What I can't live with is doing nothing and being wrong." Over the following weeks, Daniel dug carefully through records that most people would never think to check. He found an old employment history for Grace that did not match the resume she had given to the Vance shipping recruiting team. He found a gap of nearly 2 years where no verifiable record of her existed at all. No tax filings, no addresses, nothing. People did not simply disappear from every system for 2 years unless they wanted to. Charlotte, meanwhile, focused on watching Grace directly. She began attending more meetings that Grace also attended, always with a plausible reason, always with a friendly smile that gave nothing away. She noticed how carefully Grace steered conversations toward operational details that had nothing to do with marketing, port schedules, security protocols, the names of captains who ran the largest cargo vessels. Grace always asked her questions gently, wrapped inside compliments and casual curiosity, the kind of questions that seemed harmless, unless you were looking for exactly that pattern. It was during a dinner at the estate, 6 weeks into her quiet investigation, that Charlotte finally saw something she could not ignore. Grace excused herself from the table, claiming she needed to take a call from a client overseas. Charlotte, feigning a need for fresh air, followed at a distance and watched from the garden as Grace stood near the far wall, speaking in a low voice, her body angled away from the house. Charlotte could not hear every word, but she caught enough. A name, Victor, a date, spoken twice, as though confirming it with whoever was on the other end, and a phrase that stayed with Charlotte long after Grace ended the call and returned to the table with a smile, as warm and easy as ever. "Everything is on schedule." That night, Charlotte had gone straight to the study and searched, for the first time, through the drawers her father kept locked. She told herself she was not spying on her father, only trying to understand what business dealings Grace might have access to. When she found the leather notebook by accident, left carelessly in an unlocked drawer during a rare moment when Edmund had forgotten to secure it, she understood that her search was no longer about business dealings at all. The following morning, Charlotte met Daniel in the small security office on the estate's lower level, a room few guests ever saw, filled with monitors and quiet humming servers. "I found this," she said, placing the notebook on the desk between them. Daniel read through it in silence, his expression darkening with every page. When he finished, he closed it carefully and looked up at Charlotte. "This isn't guesswork anymore," he said. "This is a plan." She's been tracking shipment schedules for months. Port assignments, security shift changes, even staff vacation days. Someone is building a complete picture of when this company is most vulnerable. "Ashcombe," Charlotte said. "Almost certainly. Victor Ashcombe has been trying to push your father out of the western ports for 2 years. If he can delay or disrupt a major shipment, especially one this size, it would not just cost Vance shipping money. It could cost the company its contracts with 3 of its biggest clients. Clients who might turn to Ashcombe Global Freight instead." Charlotte sat back in her chair, her mind racing through every friendly conversation she had shared with Grace over the past 8 months. Every dinner, every laugh, every moment her father had looked happier than he had in years. All of it had been a careful performance, built to gain access to exactly the kind of information that could destroy everything he had spent his life building. "We need proof that will hold up," Charlotte said finally. "Proof my father cannot argue with. Proof that will not just remove her, but expose whoever sent her, so this never happens again." Daniel nodded slowly. "That means letting her keep working. Letting her get closer to the information she wants, just enough that we can trace exactly where it goes and who receives it. And if she gets what she needs before we're ready, then we make sure she never gets the chance to use it." From that day forward, Charlotte and Daniel built their case piece by piece, always careful, always quiet. They arranged for slightly altered shipment details to be shared in meetings Grace attended. Small changes that would not affect real operations, but would allow them to trace exactly where the false information traveled, if Grace passed it along. Within 2 weeks, those same false details appeared, word for word, in a message intercepted through a source Daniel had cultivated years earlier during his time in corporate security. A contact who now worked in a role that gave him limited but useful access to certain communication channels used by companies like Ashcombe Global Freight. The message was addressed, unmistakably, to Victor Ashcombe himself. Charlotte remembered sitting in the security office reading that intercepted message for the first time, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the strange, heavy relief of finally having undeniable proof. She had been right. Her instincts, the quiet unease she had felt since the very first week Grace joined the company, had been right all along. But being right was not enough. Proof was not the same as protection. Charlotte understood that revealing everything too soon, before Grace attempted to act on real information, rather than the false details they had planted, would only warn Ashcombe that his plan had been discovered. He would simply try again through someone else, someone Charlotte and Daniel had not yet identified. So they waited. They watched. They allowed Grace to grow more confident, more trusted, more deeply embedded in the family's life, all while quietly preparing every piece of evidence needed to end things completely, publicly, and permanently. Charlotte had not expected her father to choose tonight, of all nights, to hand Grace direct control over the true shipment details 2 weeks ahead of schedule. That single decision had just erased the careful margin of time Charlotte and Daniel had built into their plan. Standing on the platform now, watching her father's proud smile and Grace's calm, victorious expression, Charlotte understood that everything had to happen tonight instead. There would be no more waiting, no more careful staging. The moment her father finished speaking and the applause settled, Charlotte would have only seconds to act before Grace slipped away into the crowd of well-wishers, out of reach, and one step closer to finishing what she had come to do. Charlotte glanced down at her hand, resting lightly against the small earpiece hidden beneath her hair, connected directly to Daniel and the small security team he had quietly positioned around the hall over the past hour, dressed as waiters, guests, and photographers, waiting for a single signal. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself the way her father had taught her years ago, before her very first difficult negotiation. Stay calm. Let them believe you are still smiling. Strike only when you are certain. She was certain now. The applause finally began to fade, and Edmund lifted his glass toward the crowd, inviting everyone to join him in a toast. Waiters moved quickly through the room, filling empty glasses, while guests turned to each other with excited whispers about the engagement and the surprising announcement of an accelerated shipment. Charlotte remained close to her father's side, her expression calm, though every muscle in her body felt tense beneath her dress. She watched Grace accept congratulations from a line of guests forming near the platform, each handshake and embrace bringing Grace one step closer to slipping away into the crowd, where she would be harder to reach without drawing unwanted attention. Charlotte touched her father's arm gently. "Could I borrow Grace for a moment before the toasts begin? I would like to speak with her, just briefly." Edmund's face softened with obvious pleasure at the request. He had hoped, more than he ever admitted aloud, that Charlotte and Grace might grow close, especially since Charlotte had lost her mother so many years earlier. "Of course," he said warmly. "I think that would mean a great deal to her." Grace turned toward Charlotte with an easy smile, the same warm expression she had worn since the day they met. "I would love that," she said, her voice carrying just enough emotion to sound sincere to anyone listening. Charlotte led her a few steps away from the platform, toward a quieter corner of the hall near a tall window overlooking the estate's gardens. From this position, Charlotte could see Daniel Pierce shifting slightly near the far wall, and two of his team members, dressed as photographers, moving unhurried but deliberate steps closer to the exits. "I wanted to say something to you privately," Charlotte began, keeping her voice low and gentle, the same voice she had used in every conversation with Grace over the past 8 months, before all of this becomes official in front of the press. Grace's eyes flickered with something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps caution. "Of course. What is it?" "I know about the shipment schedule," Charlotte said simply. For a fraction of a second, something shifted behind Grace's expression, so small that most people would never have caught it. But Charlotte had spent 3 months learning exactly what to look for, and she saw it clearly now. A flicker of calculation, replacing warmth. Gone again, almost as quickly as it appeared. "I don't understand," Grace said carefully. "I think you do," Charlotte replied, still smiling, still speaking softly enough that no one nearby could overhear. "I know about the notebook. I know about the calls to Victor Ashcombe. I know the timeline was moved forward tonight, because you needed direct access to those final details before the real shipment date arrives." Grace's smile remained fixed in place, though her eyes had grown noticeably sharper, studying Charlotte now, the way a competitor studies an opponent, rather than the way a future stepdaughter studies a friend. "You're mistaken," Grace said, her tone still pleasant, though something colder had crept beneath the surface. "I think the excitement of tonight is making you imagine things that aren't there." "I would agree with you," Charlotte said, "except I have copies of the notebook, recordings of 3 separate calls, and a message sent directly to Victor Ashcombe with shipment details that exist nowhere, except in meetings you personally attended. Details that were deliberately altered so we could trace exactly where they traveled." Grace's expression finally cracked, just slightly, a tightening around her eyes that told Charlotte everything she needed to know. There would be no more pretending between them now. "Your father loves me," Grace said quietly, an edge entering her voice for the first time. "Whatever you think you know, that part was never false." "Maybe not," Charlotte said, and for a moment, something almost like sympathy passed through her, quickly buried beneath the weight of everything at stake. "But it doesn't change what you were sent here to do." Around them, the celebration continued, oblivious to the quiet exchange happening near the window. Edmund stood at the center of a small crowd, laughing at something one of the board members had said, completely unaware that the conversation taking place only a short distance away was about to change the course of the evening entirely. Grace's eyes moved briefly toward the nearest exit, a calculation Charlotte recognized instantly. She was measuring the distance, the time it would take to reach the door, the number of guests standing between her and freedom. "I wouldn't," Charlotte said quietly, following Grace's gaze. "There are people watching every exit in this room right now. Running will only make things worse for you." You planned this, Grace said, a note of genuine surprise entering her voice, as though she was only now truly seeing Charlotte for the first time. All this time, while I thought I was the one gathering information, you were gathering it about me. I had to be certain, Charlotte said. My father deserved certainty, not suspicion. For a long moment, Grace said nothing at all. The music continued softly in the background. Somewhere across the hall, a guest laughed loudly at a joke, the sound strangely distant against the tension building between the two women near the window. What happens now? Grace finally asked, her voice quieter than Charlotte had ever heard it. Charlotte glanced once more toward her father, still smiling among his guests, still believing this was one of the happiest nights of his life. She felt the weight of what she was about to do settle heavily across her shoulders, knowing it would break something in him that no amount of proof could fully repair. But she also thought of the notebook, filled with careful notes about vulnerable shipment windows and security gaps. She thought of the message to Victor Ashcombe, confirming that everything was on schedule. She thought of hundreds of employees who depended on Vance shipping for their livelihoods, families who had no idea how close their futures had come to being quietly sold away in exchange for a rival's advantage. Now, Charlotte said softly, turning back toward the platform where her father stood waiting to begin the formal toast. We finish this the right way. She walked back toward Edmund with steady steps, Grace following a pace behind, still smiling for the benefit of the watching guests, though Charlotte could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a closed oven. Edmund reached for Grace's hand as they approached, his face lit with genuine happiness. There you are, he said warmly. I was beginning to think you two were plotting something without me. Charlotte met her father's eyes and felt her chest tighten painfully. She thought of every version of tonight she had imagined over the past 3 months, versions where she found a way to protect him gently, quietly, without this much pain in front of so many watching eyes. But the accelerated timeline had erased every gentle option available to her. Actually, Charlotte said, raising her glass along with her father, matching the room's expectant silence as guests quieted for the coming toast. There is something I need to say before we continue. Edmund's smile faltered slightly, sensing something unfamiliar in his daughter's tone. Charlotte? She held his gaze, steadying her voice as best she could. I love you, she said simply, and everything I am about to do is because of that. Then she turned toward the back of the hall, found Daniel Pierce's waiting eyes across the crowded room, and spoke the single word they had agreed upon weeks earlier, a code phrase chosen specifically because it would sound, to anyone else listening, like nothing more than an ordinary toast. Anchors. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The guests, still holding their raised glasses, waited for Charlotte to continue whatever toast she seemed to be beginning. Then the doors at the back of the hall opened, and 4 members of estate security stepped through, moving with quiet, practiced efficiency directly toward the platform. Gasps spread through the hall like a wave. Guests turned in confusion as the security team approached the platform, their calm, deliberate pace somehow more unsettling than if they had rushed forward. Edmund's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, his eyes moving from the approaching guards to his daughter, searching for an explanation that made sense. Charlotte, what is this? He asked, his voice low but sharp with alarm. Grace's polite mask finally dropped completely. She stepped back, instinctively, her eyes scanning the room for any possible way out, but Daniel's team had already closed off every path to the exits, positioning themselves with the kind of calm precision that came from months of quiet preparation, rather than sudden improvisation. Please, everyone remain calm, Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall as he stepped up onto the platform beside Charlotte. This will only take a moment, and then the celebration can continue. The reassurance did little to calm the room. Whispers turned to open murmurs of confusion. Several board members exchanged worried glances, clearly wondering whether this sudden disruption might affect the company's reputation, or worse, its stock price should news of tonight reach outside ears, before the family had a chance to control the story. Edmund reached for Grace's arm protectively, his instinct to shield her from whatever was happening overriding his confusion for a moment. Someone explain this immediately, he said, his voice rising now, cutting through the noise of the crowd. Charlotte stepped closer to her father, keeping her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Father, I need you to trust me for the next few minutes, even though none of this will make sense right away. Trust you? Edmund's voice cracked with disbelief. You just had security surround the woman I asked to marry me, in front of everyone we know. I know how this looks, Charlotte said quietly. But I promise you, everything I am about to show you will explain why this had to happen tonight, and why it could not wait even one more day. Grace's calm expression had fully collapsed by now, replaced by something colder and more calculating, the mask she had worn for 8 months finally slipping away completely. This is absurd, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Edmund, your daughter has clearly let her imagination get the better of her. My imagination, Charlotte said, turning to face Grace directly, did not write your notebook. It did not make the calls to Victor Ashcombe. It did not send him a message 4 days ago confirming that everything was, in your words, on schedule. The name Ashcombe rippled through the crowd like a spark catching dry grass. Several board members straightened noticeably, recognizing immediately the significance of that name within their industry. Ashcombe Global Freight had been a persistent thorn in Vance Shipping's side for 2 years, and everyone in the room who worked closely with the company understood exactly what it would mean if their rival had been gathering inside information through someone as trusted as Grace. Edmund's face went pale. He looked at Grace, searching her expression for some sign that Charlotte's accusation was impossible, some flicker of the warmth and honesty he believed he had come to know over the past 8 months. But Grace said nothing, her silence somehow more damning than any denial could have been. Show me, Edmund said finally, his voice quiet now, stripped of its earlier confidence. Daniel produced a small tablet from inside his jacket and handed it to Charlotte, who turned it toward her father, revealing scanned images of the notebook's pages, alongside a transcript of the intercepted message sent to Victor Ashcombe. Edmund read through it slowly, his jaw tightening with every line, the joyful color that had filled his cheeks only minutes earlier, draining away completely. This can't be real, he murmured, though the words carried no real conviction, only the desperate hope of a man watching something precious crumble in front of him. I wish it wasn't, Charlotte said softly. I have wished that every single day for the past 3 months, since the night I found the notebook by accident in your study. Edmund's head snapped up. 3 months? You've known for 3 months and said nothing? I couldn't come to you with suspicion alone, Charlotte said, holding his gaze steadily, despite the pain visible in his eyes. You would have needed proof, and rightfully so. If I had accused her too early, Grace would have simply disappeared, and whoever sent her would have tried again through someone else, someone we might never have caught in time. Around them, the guests had grown almost completely silent now, watching the unfolding scene, with a mixture of shock and fascination that no one dared interrupt. A few reporters near the back of the hall, invited to cover what they believed would be a simple engagement announcement, exchanged quiet, urgent whispers, already composing the very different story they would now need to write. Grace finally spoke again, her voice quiet but steady, aimed directly at Edmund rather than Charlotte. I never lied about how I felt about you, she said. That much was true, even if everything else you're hearing tonight is also true. Edmund's expression twisted with a pain so raw that Charlotte had to look away for a moment, unable to watch her father absorb the full weight of the betrayal unfolding in front of hundreds of witnesses. He said nothing in response, simply staring at Grace, as though trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the person Charlotte's evidence now revealed. Take her to the security office, Daniel said quietly to the 2 guards standing closest to Grace. We'll sort out the details privately, away from all of this. Grace did not resist, as the guards moved to escort her from the platform, though her eyes remained fixed on Edmund until the very last moment, searching his face for something Charlotte suspected she would never find again. As the small procession moved toward the side exit, murmurs erupted once more through the crowd, guests turning to each other in stunned disbelief, already beginning to piece together fragments of what they had just witnessed. Charlotte remained beside her father, close enough to catch him if his legs finally gave out beneath the weight of everything he had just learned, though she suspected he would never allow himself that kind of visible weakness, not even now. I need a moment, Edmund said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, Charlotte said. Take whatever time you need. He nodded once, then turned and walked slowly toward a side door leading out onto the terrace, leaving Charlotte standing alone on the platform, in front of 300 stunned guests. The celebration she had helped orchestrate, now transformed into something far more serious, far more complicated, and far from over. Daniel approached her quietly, once the immediate chaos had settled into uneasy murmuring conversation throughout the hall. "The team has her secured in the lower office," he said. "She hasn't said much yet, but she also hasn't denied anything since the moment the notebook came out." "And the message to Ashcombe?" Charlotte asked. "Do we know if he's received confirmation of the shipment's real details yet, or only the false ones we planted?" "That's the question we still need answered," Daniel said grimly. "And we may not have much time left to find out." Down in the quiet security office on the estate's lower level, Grace sat across a narrow table from Daniel Pierce, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The bright celebration upstairs felt like it belonged to a different world entirely, replaced now by the low hum of monitors and the steady, patient silence of a man who had spent years learning how to wait for people to speak on their own. "You don't have to say anything yet," Daniel said, his tone calm rather than threatening. "But it would help you, more than you might think, if you did." Grace stared at the table for a long moment, before finally lifting her eyes. "You already have everything you need. The notebook. The recordings. What else is there to say? The reason," Daniel said simply. "People like you don't take these kinds of risks without one." Grace let out a slow breath, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, as though she had been holding it in for far longer than just tonight. "You want to know why?" she said quietly. "Fine. My younger brother worked for Victor Ashcombe 2 years ago, managing logistics at one of his smaller shipping terminals. There was an incident involving a financial discrepancy, money that went missing from accounts he oversaw. Victor made it very clear that the evidence pointing to my brother's involvement would only stay buried as long as I agreed to help him with a project involving Vance Shipping." Daniel's expression remained steady, though something in his eyes softened slightly. "And you believed him?" "I didn't have much choice," Grace said. "My brother had a young daughter, a wife who had no idea any of this was happening. Victor made sure I understood exactly what would happen to my brother's life, and by extension, his family's life, if I refused." Upstairs, unaware of this exchange, Edmund stood alone on the terrace, staring out over the dark gardens where he and Grace had walked together so many times over the past 8 months. The night air was cool against his face, though it did little to calm the storm building inside him. Charlotte found him there a few minutes later, standing quietly a respectful distance away, until he acknowledged her presence with a small, tired nod. "I keep thinking about the small things," Edmund said without turning around. "The way she used to save the last bite of dessert for me, claiming she wasn't hungry, when really, she just wanted me to have it. The way she remembered your mother's birthday every year, and always found a quiet way to make that day easier for both of us. Were those things real, Charlotte? Or was even that calculated?" Charlotte stepped closer, standing beside him at the terrace railing. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I've asked myself that same question every day for 3 months. I don't think anyone can lie perfectly for 8 months straight without some part of it being real, even if the reasons behind it were not what either of us believed." Edmund finally turned to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed but steady. "You carried this alone for 3 months," he said, "watching me fall deeper in love with someone you suspected was working against this family, and you said nothing, because you knew I wouldn't have believed you without proof." "I couldn't risk being wrong," Charlotte said, "and I couldn't risk warning her before we understood exactly how dangerous this situation really was." "I'm not angry with you," Edmund said quietly, surprising her. "I'm angry with myself, for not seeing what my own daughter managed to uncover in 3 months of careful work. I built this company by trusting my instincts about people, and tonight, I learned that even the sharpest instincts can be fooled by someone determined enough." Charlotte reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing. "You didn't fail, Father. You trusted someone who was placed in your life specifically to be trusted. That isn't a weakness. That's simply what happens when someone plans carefully enough." Before Edmund could respond, Charlotte's earpiece crackled softly with Daniel's voice, urgent despite its calm delivery. "Charlotte, you need to come downstairs. Grace has given us something important, and we don't have much time to act on it."
Charlotte met her father's eyes. "This isn't over yet."
Together they made their way down to the security office, where Daniel waited with a grim expression that told Charlotte immediately The situation had grown more complicated than she had hoped. Grace confirmed something we suspected but couldn't prove until now, Daniel said as they entered. Victor Ashcombe already received partial shipment details 3 weeks ago, before we began feeding false information through the meetings Grace attended. Real details about the Western Port's security rotation schedule. Charlotte's stomach tightened. How much does he actually know? Enough to know exactly when security coverage will be at its thinnest during the shipment window, Daniel said. If he intended to delay or disrupt that shipment through legal or logistical interference at the port, rather than anything more direct, he now has precisely the information needed to make that interference as damaging as possible. Edmund's jaw tightened, the shock of the evening's earlier revelations quickly hardening into something more focused and determined. Then we changed the plan, he said, tonight if necessary. That's easier said than done, Daniel replied carefully. A shipment of that size involves dozens of coordinated schedules, port authorities, customs clearances. Changing the timeline or route on short notice risks creating exactly the kind of confusion Ashcombe could exploit even further. Charlotte looked at Grace, who sat quietly at the table, her earlier defiance replaced now by something closer to resignation. You know Victor's operation better than any of us, Charlotte said. If you wanted to genuinely help make this right, what would you tell us to do? Grace hesitated, glancing briefly at Edmund before answering. Victor is patient, but he's also cautious. He won't act until he's certain the information he has is still accurate. If you change the shipment details now, quietly, without any public announcement, and let false confirmation reach him through the same channel Charlotte and Daniel have already been using, he'll likely wait, believing his information is still correct, right up until the real shipment has already safely passed through the vulnerable window. Daniel considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. It could work, but it means Grace needs to send one final message, convincing enough that Victor doesn't suspect anything has changed. Grace's eyes flickered with uncertainty. If I do that, and he ever learns I turned against him, my brother's family won't be safe. If you help us stop this properly, Edmund said, his voice steady despite everything the night had already cost him, I will personally make sure your brother's situation, and your family's safety, becomes something this company takes seriously. Ashcombe's leverage over you depends on secrecy. Expose what he did to force your cooperation, and that leverage disappears. Grace studied Edmund's face for a long moment, searching for the same warmth she had spent 8 months learning to recognize, and perhaps, for the first time that night, finding something real in his offer, rather than calculation. All right, she said finally. Tell me exactly what you need me to send him. The security office transformed quickly into a makeshift command center. Daniel pulled up secure communication software on one of the monitors, while Charlotte gathered the true shipment schedule from a locked file on her father's private system, the actual details known only to a handful of senior executives until tonight. We need to change 3 things, Daniel said, studying the schedule carefully. The departure time, the security escort rotation, and the secondary route through the Eastern Channel, in case the primary route needs to be avoided. Changing all 3 at once risks confusing our own port staff, Edmund said, leaning over the monitor with the focused intensity Charlotte remembered from childhood, watching him solve problems that seemed impossible to everyone else in the room. We move the departure time by 6 hours, keep the security rotation as originally planned, since Victor believes he already knows it, and prepare the Eastern Channel only as a contingency, not a public change. Charlotte nodded, quickly typing notes into a secure document that would go out to the port authority and shipment captain within the hour, verified only through channels that bypassed any system Grace might have had access to during her time gathering information for Ashcombe. Grace watched the rapid coordination with an expression Charlotte couldn't quite place, something between guilt and reluctant admiration. You work quickly, she said quietly. We've had practice, Charlotte replied, not unkindly, though the words carried the weight of the past 3 months of careful, hidden effort. Once the new details were finalized, Daniel turned to Grace. Now for your part, send Victor a message confirming the shipment remains on the original schedule, using whatever phrasing you would normally use with him. Nothing about the change we're actually making. Grace took a slow breath and typed carefully on the encrypted device Daniel provided, her fingers steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. She read the message aloud before sending it, allowing Edmund and Charlotte to confirm its tone matched the confident, familiar language she had used in previous communications with Ashcombe. Everything remains on schedule as discussed, no changes on this end. She hit send, and the small office fell into a tense silence as everyone waited, watching the screen for any sign of a reply. Minutes passed slowly. Charlotte found herself holding her breath without realizing it, her eyes fixed on the monitor alongside everyone else in the room. Finally, a reply appeared. Understood. Proceeding as planned on this end as well. Daniel exhaled audibly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. That confirms it. He still believes his information is accurate. As long as the real shipment details stay contained within this room, and the essential staff who absolutely need them, we should be able to move the actual cargo safely, before he realizes anything has changed. Edmund straightened, running a hand through his silver hair, looking older and more tired than Charlotte had ever seen him, though a quiet determination had returned to his eyes. "This isn't over," he said. "Ashcombe attempted something serious tonight, and I don't intend to simply let it disappear once the shipment passes safely." "What do you mean?" Charlotte asked. "I mean," Edmund said, "that a man willing to exploit someone's family, to plant an operative inside my own company for months, deserves more than a quiet, private victory on our part. He deserves to answer for what he's done, publicly and legally, in a way that ensures he never attempts something like this against another company." Daniel nodded slowly. "We'll need more than the notebook and the recordings for that. Everything Grace gathered under duress could be challenged in court as unreliable, given the circumstances surrounding her involvement." "Then we need something that comes directly from Ashcombe himself," Charlotte said, her mind already working through the possibilities. "Something that proves his intent, in his own words, without relying entirely on Grace's testimony." Grace, who had remained quiet during much of this exchange, spoke up unexpectedly. "I might be able to help with that." All eyes turned toward her. "Victor keeps detailed records of every operative he's placed inside competing companies over the years," she said. "It's how he protects himself, by ensuring everyone involved has as much to lose as he does if anything is exposed. Those records exist on a private server he keeps at his personal residence, not connected to any of his company's official systems." "How do you know this?" Daniel asked. "Because he showed me those files himself, 3 months ago, when I began to have doubts about continuing," Grace said quietly. "He wanted me to understand that I wasn't the only one caught in this position. There are at least 4 other operatives currently placed inside companies across the shipping industry, each with their own reasons for cooperating that Victor has carefully engineered." The weight of this revelation settled heavily over the room. Edmund's expression hardened further, the personal betrayal of tonight now clearly expanding into something with far greater consequences for the entire industry he had spent his life working within. "If those records exist," Edmund said slowly, "and we could obtain proof of them, this would no longer be simply about protecting Vance Shipping. This would be about stopping a pattern that has likely already damaged other companies who have no idea what's actually happening within their own walls." Charlotte looked at Grace, understanding now the full weight of what she was being asked to risk by continuing to help them. "If we pursue this," she said carefully, "Ashcombe will eventually realize you were the one who exposed him. Whatever protection my father offers your family, it needs to be real, and it needs to start immediately, not after everything is finished." Edmund nodded firmly. "I'll arrange protection for Grace's brother and his family tonight, before we take any further steps. Whatever this costs, in resources or otherwise, it will be handled properly." Grace's eyes glistened briefly, though she blinked the emotion away quickly, composing herself with the same practiced control Charlotte had watched her use for 8 months. Except now that control seemed to be serving an entirely different purpose. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, after what I've done. But thank you. You're not entirely to blame for the position Ashcombe forced you into," Charlotte said, surprising herself slightly with the sincerity behind the words. "That doesn't erase what happened, but it matters." Daniel cleared his throat, bringing the room's attention back to the immediate challenge ahead. "If we want proof of those records, we'll need to move carefully and quickly, before Victor has any reason to suspect his plan here has failed." Edmund looked around the room at the small group gathered before him, his daughter, his head of security, and the woman who only hours earlier he believed he might spend the rest of his life with. Whatever remained unresolved between himself and Grace personally would need to wait. Tonight, there was a larger threat still very much alive, and stopping it completely would require every piece of information Grace was willing to provide. "Then let's move quickly," Edmund said, "before the sun rises and Victor Ashcombe has any reason to believe his plan didn't work exactly as he intended." By the time the last guests had been quietly ushered out of the estate, most of them still whispering theories about what they had witnessed, the sky outside had begun to lighten with the earliest signs of dawn. Charlotte had not slept, running instead on the kind of focused energy that came from finally being able to act after months of careful waiting. Daniel had spent the early hours contacting a trusted associate, a former colleague from his years in corporate security, who now worked as an independent investigator, specializing in digital records. The plan was delicate. They could not simply break into Victor Ashcombe's private residence to access his server, not without risking serious legal consequences that could undermine any case they eventually built against him. Instead, they needed a way to obtain proof of those hidden files through means that would hold up under proper legal scrutiny. "There's another option," Grace said, sitting now in a small conference room upstairs, rather than the security office, no longer treated as a suspect, but not yet fully trusted as an ally either. "Victor requires quarterly check-ins from everyone he's placed as an operative, in person, at his residence. My next scheduled visit isn't for another 2 weeks, but I could request an earlier meeting, claiming urgency related to the shipment." "You want to go back to him?" Edmund said, his voice sharp with concern. "After everything that happened tonight?" "If I don't," Grace said, "he'll eventually grow suspicious that no confirmation of the shipment's actual departure has reached him through the usual channels. A scheduled visit gives me a legitimate reason to be there, and it gives us a chance to gather something concrete." Daniel frowned, clearly uneasy with the risk involved. "If you're wearing any kind of recording device, and he discovers it, the danger to you increases significantly. Then we find a way that doesn't put her at that kind of risk," Charlotte said firmly. "There has to be another approach." It was Edmund, surprisingly, who offered the solution. Years of navigating difficult negotiations across the shipping industry had taught him more about strategy than even Charlotte fully appreciated. "Victor's real weakness isn't hidden information," he said. "It's his confidence. He believes he's several steps ahead of everyone, including us. That confidence is exactly what we should use against him." "What do you mean?" Charlotte asked. "I mean," Edmund said, "that instead of trying to steal proof from him quietly, we give him a reason to reveal it himself, in a setting where his own words become the proof we need." Over the following 2 days, working with a legal team Edmund trusted completely, they built a careful plan. Grace would request an in-person meeting, not simply a quarterly check-in, claiming she had encountered a serious problem worth discussing directly. She would tell Victor that Charlotte had grown suspicious, close to uncovering the entire operation, and that she needed guidance on how to proceed given the increased risk. The meeting was arranged for a private office within one of Ashcombe Global Freight's own buildings, a location Victor considered secure, specifically because it was so thoroughly under his control. What Victor did not know was that Edmund's legal team, working carefully within the boundaries of the law, had arranged for Grace to wear a small, properly authorized recording device as part of an active cooperation agreement now formally documented with legal counsel, protecting both Grace and the eventual case against Victor from any challenge regarding how the evidence was obtained. Charlotte waited anxiously with Daniel and Edmund in a car parked several blocks away on the day of the meeting, listening through a secure connection as Grace entered Victor's building. "You said this was urgent." Victor's voice came through clearly, calm and measured, exactly the kind of controlled confidence Charlotte had expected from someone capable of orchestrating such a careful operation. "Charlotte Vance knows more than we anticipated," Grace said, her voice steady, despite everything Charlotte knew she must be feeling in that moment. "I need to understand exactly how deep this goes, so I know what to protect if things fall apart." There was a pause, followed by the sound of a door closing, presumably Victor ensuring privacy before continuing. "You're not the only piece on this board, Grace. You know that. Even if Vance Shipping's daughter suspects something involving you specifically, she has no way of connecting it to the operatives I have placed at 3 other companies." 3 others, Grace repeated carefully, drawing out the confirmation they desperately needed. Harrington Logistics, Sable Maritime, and the newest addition at Colton Freight Solutions. though that one is still in its early stages, Victor said, his voice carrying a note of pride that Charlotte found genuinely unsettling to hear. Each of them believes they are the only one, exactly as you did until recently. It keeps everyone focused, controlled, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. In the car, Daniel exhaled slowly, exchanging a grim glance with Edmund. That's 3 other companies with no idea what's happening inside their own operations, he murmured. The recording continued for several more minutes, Victor growing increasingly detailed in his explanation, confident that he was simply reassuring a nervous operative, rather than confirming, in his own voice, the full scope of an operation that would soon become impossible for him to deny. When Grace finally left the building nearly 40 minutes later, she climbed into the waiting car with visibly shaking hands, though her voice remained steady. "It's done," she said. "Everything he said should be on the recording." Edmund reached over and gently squeezed her shoulder, an unexpected gesture of gratitude that seemed to surprise Grace as much as it surprised Charlotte. "You did something incredibly difficult," he said. "Whatever happens between us personally, what you just did will help protect far more than just this company." Charlotte, listening back through a portion of the recording on Daniel's device, felt a mixture of relief and unease settle over her. They finally had what they needed, clear, undeniable proof of Victor Ashcombe's operation, spoken directly from his own mouth. But 3 other companies remained unaware of the danger, sitting quietly inside their own walls, and Charlotte understood that exposing Victor now would mean far more than simply protecting her own family's business. "We need to warn them," she said. "Harrington, Sable, and Colton. Before we take any of this to the authorities, they deserve to know what's happening inside their own companies." Edmund nodded slowly, already thinking several steps ahead in the way that had built Vance Shipping into what it was today. "Then that's exactly what we'll do," he said. Quietly, carefully, and before Victor Ashcombe has any idea that his confidence tonight just became the very thing that brings his entire operation down around him. Reaching out to 3 competing companies, without revealing too much too soon, required a delicate touch. Edmund understood that simply calling their executives and announcing that a rival had planted operatives inside their organizations would sound, to anyone unprepared for such news, like an elaborate excuse to gain competitive advantage, rather than a genuine warning. Instead, Edmund arranged a private meeting through an industry association he had helped establish years earlier, a quiet gathering of shipping executives that occasionally met to discuss matters affecting the entire sector rather than individual companies. He requested time on the agenda, framing his presentation only as an urgent security matter affecting multiple organizations, without naming anyone specifically until the meeting itself. Charlotte sat beside her father in the small conference room 3 days later, watching the presidents of Harrington Logistics, Sable Maritime, and Colton Freight Solutions settle into their seats, each unaware of what was about to unfold. Grace remained at the estate under Daniel's protection, along with her brother's family, who had been quietly relocated to a secure location the moment Edmund learned the full extent of what Victor Ashcombe was capable of. "Thank you all for making time on short notice," Edmund began, his voice carrying the same calm authority Charlotte had watched him use in countless negotiations over the years, though she knew the toll the past several days had taken on him privately. "What I'm about to share affects each of your companies directly, and I felt it was important you heard it from me personally, rather than through rumor or speculation." He proceeded carefully, laying out the discovery of Grace's true purpose within Vance Shipping, the notebook, the intercepted messages, and finally, the recorded conversation, confirming Victor Ashcombe's broader operation across the industry. As he spoke, Charlotte watched the color drain from each executive's face in turn, disbelief giving way slowly to a dawning, uncomfortable recognition. "We hired a marketing consultant 6 months ago," the president of Harrington Logistics said quietly, almost to herself. "She came highly recommended, seemed perfect for the role. I never once questioned her background. Colton Freight brought on a new operations analyst just 2 months ago," the representative from that company added, his expression darkening. "He's been asking unusually detailed questions about our upcoming contract negotiations." The president of Sable Maritime remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I need to see this recording myself," he said. "If what you're telling us is accurate, this isn't simply an unfortunate incident. This is a coordinated effort to undermine every major competitor Victor Ashcombe has in this region. Edmund played the relevant portion of the recording, Victor's own voice filling the quiet conference room with damning clarity as he described each operative and their placement within the competing companies. By the time the recording ended, the mood in the room had shifted entirely. Disbelief replaced by a shared, determined resolve. "What do you propose we do?" the Harrington Logistics president asked. "I believe," Edmund said, "that our best chance of stopping this properly and ensuring Victor Ashcombe faces real consequences is to approach this together rather than separately. If each of us pursued this individually, he would have the resources and legal expertise to challenge us one at a time. Together, with corroborating evidence from each affected company, the case becomes far harder to dismiss or delay." Over the following 2 weeks, Charlotte watched her father coordinate a careful, methodical effort between the 4 affected companies, working alongside legal teams from each organization to build a case strong enough to bring before both civil courts and relevant regulatory authorities overseeing fair business practices within the shipping industry. Harrington Logistics quietly began an internal review that confirmed their consultant had indeed been gathering sensitive operational details. Colton Freight discovered similar evidence involving their newly hired analyst. Sable Maritime uncovered records suggesting their situation had been developing for even longer than anyone initially suspected. Grace, meanwhile, worked closely with legal counsel to formalize her full cooperation, providing detailed testimony about how Victor had approached her, the pressure he applied regarding her brother's situation, and the broader structure of his operation across multiple companies. Her brother's financial discrepancy, once carefully examined by an independent auditor Edmund arranged personally, was found to be far less serious than Victor had led Grace to believe, a manufactured crisis exaggerated specifically to secure her continued cooperation through fear rather than genuine wrongdoing. "He never had as much control over my situation as I believed," Grace told Charlotte one evening, sitting together in the estate's quiet library, while Daniel's team continued monitoring updates from the ongoing investigation. "I spent 2 years terrified of what would happen to my brother's family if I stopped helping him, and it turns out the entire threat was built on exaggerated claims he knew I had no way to verify independently. Fear works best when people don't have the resources to question it," Charlotte said. "You didn't have anyone helping you look closer. Now you do." Grace studied Charlotte carefully, something like genuine respect entering her expression for the first time since the night of the engagement announcement. "You could have exposed me the moment you found that notebook," she said. "Instead, you spent 3 months building a case, careful enough to protect both this company and, eventually, me as well. Most people wouldn't have shown that kind of patience. My father taught me that acting too quickly on incomplete information usually causes more damage than waiting for certainty," Charlotte said. "It wasn't always easy, watching you and my father grow closer while knowing what I knew. But rushing would have risked losing the chance to stop something far bigger than just protecting my father's heart." As the investigation continued gathering strength, word eventually reached Victor Ashcombe that something had shifted within his carefully constructed operation. Charlotte learned, through updates from the joint legal team, that Victor had grown increasingly erratic in his business dealings over the following weeks, canceling meetings abruptly, reassigning key staff members without clear explanation, behavior consistent with someone who sensed his control slipping away, but had not yet identified exactly how or why. It was during a quiet evening, nearly 3 weeks after the engagement announcement, that had started everything. While Charlotte sat reviewing final case documents with her father in his study, that Daniel arrived with news they had been anxiously awaiting. "The regulatory authority has agreed to formally open an investigation into Ashcombe Global Freight," he said, "based on the combined evidence from all 4 companies. Victor has been notified and is required to appear before an initial hearing within the month." Edmund set down the document he had been reading, exhaling slowly, the tension of the past 3 weeks finally beginning to loosen from his shoulders. "It's really happening," he said quietly. "It's really happening," Daniel confirmed. "Whatever comes next, Victor Ashcombe will finally have to answer, publicly and formally, for what he's done, not just to Vance Shipping, but to every company he believed he could quietly control from the shadows." The hearing took place a month later in a formal conference room within the regulatory authority's downtown offices, a setting far removed from the grand hall where the entire situation had first come to light. Charlotte sat beside her father in the gallery, watching as representatives from Vance Shipping, Harrington Logistics, Sable Maritime, and Colton Freight Solutions presented their combined evidence before a panel of officials tasked with determining whether formal charges should proceed. Victor Ashcombe sat across the room with his own legal team, his composure carefully maintained despite the mounting evidence being presented against him. Charlotte studied him during a brief recess, noting the same calculated confidence Grace had once described, though now it seemed increasingly strained beneath the weight of what 4 companies working together had managed to uncover. Grace testified during the afternoon session, her voice steady despite the difficulty of recounting, in careful detail, exactly how Victor had approached her nearly 2 years earlier, exploiting her brother's manufactured crisis to secure her cooperation. Charlotte watched several panel members exchange troubled glances as Grace described the psychological pressure Victor had applied, methods that appeared consistent, according to testimony from operatives at the other 3 companies, with a deliberate and repeated pattern rather than an isolated incident. "I want to be clear," Grace said near the end of her testimony, "that nothing about my cooperation with the investigation excuses the harm I caused by gathering information under false pretenses, but I hope this testimony makes clear exactly how Victor Ashcombe operates and how many people's lives he has affected through manufactured threats and careful manipulation." The panel's questions grew increasingly pointed as the hearing continued into its second day, with representatives from the other 3 affected companies providing their own detailed accounts of operatives placed within their organizations, each following remarkably similar patterns of recruitment through manufactured pressure or exaggerated leverage. By the time the hearing concluded on the 3rd day, the panel announced its decision to move forward with formal charges against Victor Ashcombe, citing violations of fair business practice regulations, along with a recommendation that separate civil proceedings be pursued by each affected company to recover damages related to the operation. Outside the building following the announcement, reporters gathered eagerly, hoping for statements from the various executives involved. Edmund, standing beside Charlotte on the courthouse steps, addressed the small crowd with the same measured composure Charlotte had watched him display throughout countless difficult moments over the years. "This has been a difficult chapter for our company, and for the other organizations affected by Victor Ashcombe's actions," Edmund said. "But I want to emphasize something important. This outcome exists because people were willing to work together rather than remain isolated in fear or suspicion, and because my daughter had the patience and determination to uncover the full truth rather than settling for easy answers." Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest at her father's words, spoken publicly and without hesitation, acknowledging everything the past month had cost them both. A reporter near the front called out a question. "Mr. Vance, is it true that your daughter's discovery began with a personal relationship and that this entire investigation started with your own engagement announcement?" Edmund glanced at Charlotte, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "It's true that my personal life became unexpectedly connected to a much larger issue affecting this entire industry," he said carefully. "I've learned, through this experience, that sometimes the people closest to us see things we cannot see ourselves, especially when we allow our hopes to outweigh our caution. I'm grateful, more than I can properly express, that my daughter chose to protect this family and this company, even when doing so meant risking my anger and my heartbreak." The following weeks brought a steady stream of developments. Victor Ashcombe's legal team pursued various delays and challenges, though the combined weight of evidence from 4 separate companies made his position increasingly difficult to defend. Grace, having fully cooperated with the investigation, avoided formal charges related to her own involvement, given the documented coercion and manipulation she had endured, though she voluntarily stepped away from her role at Vance Shipping, understanding that rebuilding trust would take far longer than any formal resolution could provide. "Where will you go?" Charlotte asked her during one of their final conversations at the estate, as Grace prepared to leave for a fresh start in a city where her brother's family had already begun settling into their new, protected life. "Somewhere quiet, for a while," Grace said. "I spent 2 years living carefully constructed lies. I think I need some time to remember what an honest life actually feels like." "For what it's worth," Charlotte said. "I don't think everything between you and my father was false. I watched you both for 8 months, closely enough to recognize the difference between performance and genuine feeling, even when I didn't want to admit what I was seeing." Grace's eyes glistened briefly. "Thank you for saying that. I don't expect your father to ever fully trust me again, and I understand why. But knowing that you saw something real, even amid everything else, means more than you probably realize." Edmund, for his part, threw himself into rebuilding the company's operations and reputation over the following months, working closely alongside Charlotte in a way that gradually transformed their relationship from father guiding daughter into genuine partnership between equals. The shipment that had once been at the center of so much danger completed its journey successfully, arriving at its destination without incident, a small but meaningful victory amid the larger, ongoing legal proceedings against Victor Ashcombe. Charlotte found herself, in quiet moments during those months, reflecting on the smile she had worn the night everything began, standing beside her father as he prepared to make an announcement that would upend both their lives. That smile had carried a secret so heavy it had nearly broken something between them. But it had also carried a promise, one she had kept through 3 months of careful, patient work, and one that had ultimately protected far more than just her father's heart. Nearly a year after the night of the engagement announcement, Vance Shipping held another gathering in the same grand hall, though this occasion carried a very different purpose. The company had weathered the storm of the previous year's revelations, emerging not only intact but strengthened by the close alliance formed between the 4 companies that had worked together to expose Victor Ashcombe's operation. His formal trial had concluded 3 months earlier, resulting in significant financial penalties and the dissolution of Ashcombe Global Freight's operations across the region, along with separate civil settlements that provided meaningful compensation to each affected company. Charlotte stood once again near the platform, though this time, the smile on her face carried no hidden calculations, no careful masks concealing months of quiet investigation. Tonight's gathering celebrated something far simpler and far more deserved: the formal announcement of Charlotte's promotion to co-chief executive of Vance Shipping, a role she would now share fully with her father as he began gradually stepping back from daily operations. Edmund took the platform much as he had a year earlier, though his expression carried a different kind of pride this time, steadier and more grounded than the giddy happiness that had once made him vulnerable to Victor Ashcombe's carefully constructed scheme. "A year ago, I stood in this same room and made an announcement that changed the course of this company, and honestly, the course of my own life, in ways I never anticipated," Edmund said, his voice carrying easily across the attentive crowd. "Tonight, I want to make a different kind of announcement, one built not on hope alone, but on proof, patience, and hard-earned trust." He turned toward Charlotte, extending his hand as she stepped forward to join him. "My daughter spent 3 months quietly protecting this company and this family, at tremendous personal cost, before finally acting to stop a threat that could have destroyed everything we've built. She did this not because anyone asked her to, but because she understood, perhaps better than I did at the time, that protecting the people and the company she loves sometimes requires patience most people cannot manage, and courage most people cannot summon when the moment finally arrives." Applause filled the hall, warm and genuine, entirely different from the uncertain, confused reaction that had followed the events of the previous year. Charlotte scanned the crowd and found Daniel Pierce standing near the back, exactly where he had stood a year earlier, though this time his expression carried quiet satisfaction rather than tense readiness. Among the guests, seated near the front, were representatives from Harrington Logistics, Sable Maritime, and Colton Freight Solutions, companies that had become close allies over the past year. Their combined effort against Victor Ashcombe having grown into an ongoing partnership focused on strengthening security practices across the entire industry. "I want to also acknowledge someone who isn't here tonight," Edmund continued, his voice softening slightly, "but whose courage played an essential role in bringing the full truth to light. Her cooperation, given at tremendous personal risk, helped protect not only this company, but 3 others as well, and I hope, wherever she is now, she has found the peace and safety she deserves." Charlotte thought of Grace occasionally throughout the year, wondering how she had settled into her new life, hoping that whatever came next for her carried more honesty and less fear, than the 2 years she had spent trapped within Victor Ashcombe's careful manipulation. A brief, handwritten letter had arrived at the estate several months earlier, no return address included, simply a short message thanking Edmund and Charlotte for the protection extended to her brother's family, along with a quiet wish for both of their continued happiness and success. Charlotte had shown the letter to her father, and though he said little in response, she had noticed him keeping it carefully in his desk drawer afterward, a small, private acknowledgement of complicated feelings that would likely take much longer than a year to fully resolve. As the celebration continued into the evening, Charlotte found herself standing near the same window where she had first confronted Grace a year earlier, looking out over the gardens now illuminated softly by strings of lights prepared for tonight's occasion. Daniel approached quietly, offering her a glass of sparkling water rather than champagne, a small joke between them about the long night still ahead of coordinating final details for tomorrow's board meeting. "Quite a difference from last year," he said, following her gaze out toward the gardens. "A world of difference," Charlotte agreed, "though I think I'll always remember standing right here, watching Grace glance toward the exits, wondering if she would try to run." "You handled it well," Daniel said. "Better than most people twice your age would have managed under that kind of pressure." Charlotte smiled, a genuine, easy expression, far removed from the careful, calculated smile she had worn the night everything began. "I had good teachers," she said, glancing toward her father, still surrounded by well-wishers near the platform, his laugh carrying warmly across the hall, in a way that reminded her, comfortingly, of the man she had always known him to be before Grace, and the man he had continued to be throughout the difficult months that followed. Edmund caught her eye across the room and made his way toward her, leaving behind a small cluster of board members still discussing the evening's announcement. "Enjoying your own celebration?" he asked, a teasing warmth in his voice that Charlotte had missed during the tense months following the investigation's beginning. "I think I prefer celebrating quietly," Charlotte admitted, "though I suppose that's exactly why you're better suited for these public moments than I am." "We balance each other," Edmund said simply. "That's what makes a good partnership, whether in business or in family. I spent this past year learning that lesson more thoroughly than I ever expected to, at my age." Charlotte looked out once more over the gardens, thinking of everything that had unfolded since that first tense evening a year earlier. The careful investigation, the difficult confrontation, the race to protect not just her father's company but 3 others as well, and finally, the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust between herself and her father afterward. "I'm proud of what we built from something that could have destroyed us," she said quietly. Edmund placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his expression carrying the same warmth and pride Charlotte remembered from her childhood, before her mother's passing, before Grace, before any of the difficulties that had tested their family over the past year. "So am I," he said. "So am I." Together, they turned back toward the celebration, the grand hall filled with warm light and easy laughter, a stark and welcome contrast to the tense, careful smile Charlotte had worn a year earlier, when a single word had changed everything, and when protecting the people she loved most had meant becoming, if only for one difficult night, someone far more calculating and far more courageous than anyone in that hall had ever expected her to be.